I woke up at 6 in the morning to what sounded like someone rummaging through my car in the driveway. And by the time I threw on my jacket and rushed outside in my pajama pants, I caught a glimpse of Patricia Whitmore from the Homeowners Association walking away from my Ford F-150 with something in her hand. The February morning air in Columbus, Ohio, hit me like a wall of ice, and I could see my breath creating clouds as I jogged across the frozen driveway toward my truck. The door was slightly ajar, not locked because, honestly, I lived in what I thought was a safe neighborhood called Westbridge Commons, and the only thing anyone had to worry about around here was which mailbox design violated the HOA's absurdly strict guidelines. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the quiet suburban street. "Patricia, what are you doing?" She turned around, and even in the dim pre-dawn light, I could see that familiar expression of self-righteousness plastered across her face. Patricia was in her early 50s, with a blonde bob haircut that looked like it required daily appointments at the salon, and she wore a puffy white winter coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. In her gloved hand, she held my ice scraper, the good one with the brush on one end and the heavy-duty scraper on the other. "Franklin Thompson," she said, pronouncing my name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "I am confiscating this item as evidence of your continued violation of HOA regulations." I stood there for a moment, genuinely confused. "That's my ice scraper from my car. You just broke into my vehicle." "I did not break in," Patricia said, lifting her chin. "The door was unlocked, which is also a violation according to Section 12, Paragraph 8 of the Community Guidelines. Unlocked vehicles present a security risk and lower property values." "That's not even a real rule," I said, walking closer. My feet were freezing in my slippers, and I could feel the cold seeping through the thin fabric. "And even if it was, you can't just take things from my car. That's theft." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "This ice scraper was sitting on your dashboard, visible from the street. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3, no automotive maintenance equipment or tools may be visible from public-facing windows of vehicles parked in driveways. It creates an unsightly appearance and suggests a lack of care for community standards." I wanted to laugh, but I was too cold and too angry. This was peak Patricia Whitmore behavior. She had been elected as the HOA president 3 years ago, and since then, she had made it her personal mission to fine, harass, and generally make life miserable for everyone in Westbridge Commons. I had already received 17 citations in the past year alone for things like leaving my trash visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup, having grass that was 1/4 inch too tall, and parking my work van in my driveway overnight because apparently commercial vehicles were forbidden. "Give me back my ice scraper," I said, holding out my hand. "No," Patricia replied simply. "This will be entered into evidence for your hearing next week. You have accumulated sufficient violations to warrant a special session of the HOA board, and we will be discussing potential remediation measures, including additional fines." "It's an ice scraper," I said, my frustration mounting. "It's February in Ohio. Everyone has an ice scraper in their car." "Everyone is not parked in Westbridge Commons," Patricia said. "And everyone does not flagrantly disregard the community standards that the rest of us work so hard to maintain." She turned on her heel and marched toward her own house, which was 3 doors down from mine. I watched her go, the ice scraper clutched in her hand like some kind of trophy. My hands were shaking, partly from cold and partly from sheer disbelief. I went back inside, my wife Clara still asleep upstairs, and I made myself a strong cup of coffee while trying to process what had just happened. By the time I showered and got dressed for work, the sun was starting to rise, and I could see from my kitchen window that Patricia's car, a silver Mercedes SUV, was covered in a thick layer of ice from the freezing rain we had gotten overnight. I grabbed my spare ice scraper from the garage, a cheap plastic one I kept as a backup, and headed out to clear my own windshield before heading to my job as an HVAC technician. As I scraped the ice off my truck, I noticed Patricia emerging from her house, dressed in an expensive-looking pantsuit and carrying her designer purse. She walked to her Mercedes and stood there for a moment, staring at the ice-covered windshield. Then, to my absolute amazement, she pulled out my ice scraper, the one she had stolen from my car less than an hour ago. I stopped what I was doing and watched, fascinated by the audacity. She positioned herself by the driver's side and began attacking the ice on her windshield with aggressive, almost violent scraping motions. The problem was immediately apparent to anyone who had ever used an ice scraper properly. She was holding it at completely the wrong angle and pressing down with way too much force. The sound reached me even from 3 houses away, a horrible screeching, scratching noise that made me wince. Patricia seemed oblivious, continuing her assault on the ice with increasing frustration. She scraped harder, pushing the tool across the glass with jerky, uncontrolled movements. I could see her face contorting with effort, her breath creating clouds in the cold air. Then I heard it, a distinct cracking sound followed by Patricia's shriek of dismay. I finished clearing my own windshield and climbed into my truck, starting the engine to let it warm up. Through my rearview mirror, I watched as Patricia examined her windshield, her face turning red even in the cold. She looked around frantically, and then her eyes landed on me. Even from this distance, I could see the rage building. She stomped down the street toward my house, my ice scraper still in her hand, and I rolled down my window as she approached. "You," she screamed, her voice shrill. "You did this on purpose." "Did what?" I asked calmly, though my heart was racing. "This ice scraper is defective," Patricia shouted, waving it at me. "It scratched my windshield. There's a crack going all the way across." I looked at the ice scraper, the same one I had been using for 3 years without incident, and then back at Patricia. "That's impossible. That scraper works fine. I've used it hundreds of times." "You gave me a faulty tool intentionally," Patricia accused. "This is property damage and I'll be adding it to your violations. You're going to pay for a new windshield." "I didn't give you anything," I said, my voice steady despite my anger. "You stole it from my car this morning. Remember?" Patricia's face went through several shades of red. "I confiscated it as evidence of a violation, and now I have evidence of your negligence causing damage to my property. How is it my fault that you don't know how to use an ice scraper?" I asked. "You were scraping way too hard. I watched you from my window." "Lies," Patricia shrieked. "I know exactly how to use an ice scraper. I've been driving for 30 years. A few neighbors had started to emerge from their houses, drawn by Patricia's shouting. I recognized Tom Martinez from across the street and elderly Mrs. Henderson from next door. "You're going to pay for this, Franklin," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a threatening tone. "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for tonight, 7 o'clock at the community center. Attendance is mandatory." She turned and marched back toward her house, still carrying my ice scraper. I sat in my truck for a moment, processing the absurdity of the situation, and then I pulled out my phone and started recording a voice memo, documenting everything that had just happened while it was fresh in my mind. Work that day was a blur. I installed 2 new furnaces and fixed a broken heat pump, but my mind kept wandering back to Patricia and the ice scraper incident. During my lunch break, I called my wife Clara, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. "She did what?" Clara asked, her voice incredulous. I repeated the story, including the part where Patricia had scratched her own windshield and was now blaming me for it. Franklin, this is theft, Clara said firmly. She stole property from your car. I don't care what HOA regulation she's citing. You can't just take things from someone's vehicle. I know, I said, eating my sandwich with one hand while holding the phone with the other. But you know how she is. She'll twist it somehow, make it about the HOA rules. The HOA doesn't supersede the law, Clara pointed out. I think you should file a police report. I considered this. Part of me wanted to just let it go, to not escalate things further. But another part of me, the part that was tired of Patricia's constant harassment and ridiculous citations, wanted to stand up for myself. Let me see what happens at the meeting tonight, I said. If she's reasonable, Clara laughed. Patricia Whitmore. Reasonable? Have you met her? She had a point. The community center at Westbridge Commons was a modest building at the center of the development with a small meeting room that could hold about 30 people. When I arrived at 6:55 that evening, the parking lot was already half full. Apparently, word had spread about the emergency meeting, and people were curious. Inside, I found about 20 of my neighbors seated in folding chairs facing a table at the front where Patricia sat with the other 2 HOA board members. Gregory Kane, a retired accountant who mostly just nodded along with whatever Patricia said, and Susan Drummond, a middle-aged woman who seemed perpetually exhausted by Patricia's antics but never actually opposed her. My ice scraper sat on the table in front of Patricia like exhibit at a trial. I took a seat near the back, next to Tom Martinez, who leaned over and whispered, "Heard Patricia messed up her windshield this morning." "She's claiming my ice scraper was defective," I whispered back. Tom snorted. "Right, because ice scrapers are known for being high-tech, complicated devices." At exactly 7 o'clock, Patricia called the meeting to order by rapping her knuckles on the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice taking on that formal, officious tone she used for HOA business. "We are here to address a serious matter involving Franklin Thompson and multiple violations of community standards." I raised my hand. "Can I say something?" "You'll have your turn to speak," Patricia said dismissively. "First, I need to present the evidence to the board." She picked up my ice scraper and held it up like a prosecutor in a courtroom drama. "This morning, at approximately 6:15, I discovered this automotive maintenance tool displayed prominently on the dashboard of Mr. Thompson's vehicle, in clear violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our community guidelines. The tool was visible from the street, creating an unsightly appearance that negatively impacts our neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Several people in the audience exchanged glances. Mrs. Henderson, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, actually rolled her eyes. Patricia continued, "I confiscated the item as evidence, as is my right as HOA president when documenting violations. However, when I attempted to examine the tool more closely this morning, I discovered that it was defective and dangerous. The scraping edge caused significant damage to the windshield of my vehicle, resulting in a large crack that will require professional repair." She set the ice scraper down and pulled out her phone, showing photos of her cracked windshield to Gregory and Susan. "As you can see, the damage is extensive. I estimate the repair cost will be approximately $800. "That's ridiculous," I said, standing up. "I didn't give you permission to use my ice scraper. You took it from my car without asking." Patricia's eyes flashed. "I confiscated it as evidence. You stole it," I corrected. "And then you damaged your own property by using it incorrectly. I watched you from my window. You were scraping way too hard and at the wrong angle." Are you calling me incompetent? Patricia demanded. I'm saying you don't know how to use an ice scraper properly, I replied. That tool has worked perfectly fine for 3 years. The problem isn't the scraper. The problem is user error. A few people in the audience murmured agreement. Patricia's face was turning red again. Mr. Thompson, you are out of order, she snapped. I am the HOA president and I have the authority to— You don't have the authority to steal from people's cars, I interrupted. That's actual theft. It doesn't matter what HOA rule you're citing. You can't just take someone's property. Gregory Kane cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should discuss this more calmly. There's nothing to discuss, Patricia said. Mr. Thompson will be fined $1,500 for the initial violation of leaving automotive equipment visible in his vehicle, plus an additional $800 to cover the cost of repairing my windshield. If he refuses to pay, we will place a lien on his property. The room erupted. Multiple people started talking at once, most of them in protest. Susan Drummond looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. You can't fine him for damaging your car when you're the one who used his scraper. Tom Martinez shouted from beside me. Yeah, this is insane. Someone else called out. Patricia banged her hand on the table. Order. I will have order in this meeting. But the crowd wasn't having it. People were standing up, voicing their own complaints about Patricia's leadership and the ridiculous fines they had received over the years. One woman talked about getting cited for having a wreath on her door that was the wrong shade of green. A man described being fined because his mailbox post was allegedly 3 inches taller than regulation height. I watched as Patricia's authoritarian control of the meeting completely fell apart. Her face was scarlet and she kept trying to shout over the crowd, but no one was listening anymore. Finally, I held up my hands and said loudly, "Everyone, please." The room gradually quieted down and people turned to look at me. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I don't want to cause problems. I just want my ice scraper back and I want Patricia to stop harassing everyone with these ridiculous fines. We all live here. We all pay our HOA dues, but this has gotten out of control." "Absolutely," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. She stood up, using her cane for support. "I've lived in Westbridge Commons for 12 years, and I have never seen such tyrannical behavior from an HOA president. Patricia, you need to step down." "I will do no such thing," Patricia shrieked. "I was elected by the community." "You ran unopposed because no one else wanted the job," Tom Martinez pointed out. Susan Drummond finally spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "Patricia, maybe we should table this discussion and revisit it next month. This situation has become too heated." "No," Patricia said stubbornly. "We're settling this tonight. Franklin Thompson will pay the fines or I will pursue legal action." I pulled out my phone. "Okay, then I'm calling the police to report a theft." Patricia's eyes went wide. "You wouldn't dare." "Watch me," I said, already dialing. For a moment, Patricia looked genuinely panicked. Then she composed herself, lifting her chin in that familiar gesture of defiance. "Go ahead. The police will side with the HOA. We have the legal authority to enforce community standards." "The HOA doesn't have the authority to commit theft," I repeated. "I've been patient with you, Patricia. I've paid your ridiculous fines. I've followed your absurd rules, but this crosses a line." The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as clearly as I could. The woman on the other end of the line sounded bemused but professional, and she said she would send an officer to take a report. Patricia sat back in her chair, her arms crossed, looking supremely confident that this would all work out in her favor. Gregory Kane and Susan Drummond exchanged worried looks, but said nothing. Officer Daniel Reeves arrived about 15 minutes later. a young patrolman with a notebook and a slightly confused expression. The meeting had dissolved into small groups of neighbors talking among themselves, but everyone went quiet when the police officer entered. "Someone called about a theft," Officer Reeves asked. I raised my hand and walked over to him. "Yes, sir. That was me." I explained the entire situation. Waking up to find Patricia taking my ice scraper from my unlocked car, her claim that she was confiscating it as evidence of an HOA violation, her using the scraper and damaging her own windshield, and now her demand that I pay for the repair. Officer Reeves listened carefully, taking notes. Then he turned to Patricia. "Madam, is this accurate? Did you remove property from this man's vehicle?" "I confiscated it as evidence," Patricia said primly. "As HOA president, I have the authority to document violations and collect evidence." "Do you have that in writing?" Officer Reeves asked. "Some kind of legal statute that gives you the authority to take items from someone's car?" Patricia hesitated. "It's in our community guidelines." "Community guidelines don't supersede the law," Officer Reeves said. He looked at me. "Sir, did you give her permission to take this item?" "No," I said firmly. "She took it without asking while I was inside my house." Officer Reeves nodded and made another note. "Madam, I'm going to need you to return the item to Mr. Thompson immediately." "But it's evidence." Patricia protested. "Evidence of what crime?" Officer Reeves asked patiently. "Of his violation of HOA regulations." "HOA violations aren't criminal matters," Officer Reeves explained. "They're civil disputes. You don't have the authority to confiscate someone's property, even if you believe they've violated an HOA rule. That's theft." Patricia's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally calculation. "So you're taking his side?" "I'm explaining the law," Officer Reeves said. "If you don't return his property right now, I can charge you with theft." For a long moment, Patricia just stared at him. The entire room was silent, everyone watching to see what would happen. Finally, with a jerky, angry motion, Patricia grabbed my ice scraper from the table and shoved it toward me. "Here," she spat. "Take it." I took the ice scraper, feeling a small sense of victory, but Officer Reeves wasn't done. "Now," he said, turning back to Patricia, "you mentioned that you used this scraper and it damaged your windshield." "Yes," Patricia said eagerly, apparently thinking the officer was going to support her claim. "It's defective. The scraper edge is too sharp or something. It put a huge crack in my windshield." "So you took someone's property without permission and then used it," Officer Reeves clarified. Patricia seemed to realize her mistake. I was examining it for the HOA board. By using it on your car, I needed to test whether it was actually a functional tool or just for display," Patricia said, her voice becoming defensive. Officer Reeves looked at me. "Sir, do you want to press charges for the theft?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to, just to teach Patricia a lesson. But I could see how scared she looked now, how the reality of potential criminal charges was finally breaking through her sense of entitlement. "No," I said finally. "I just want my ice scraper back and for her to leave me alone." Officer Reeves nodded. "Fair enough." He turned back to Patricia. "Madam, I strongly suggest you review your HOA procedures with a lawyer. You don't have the authority to take people's property, and if I get another call like this, I will press charges." "Understood." Patricia nodded stiffly, not meeting his eyes. After Officer Reeves left, the meeting officially ended, though most people hung around to talk. Multiple neighbors came up to me to express their support and share their own horror stories about Patricia's reign as HOA president. Tom Martinez suggested we organize a recall election to remove her from the board, and several people immediately agreed. Patricia left without another word, her face still flushed with anger and humiliation. Susan Drummond approached me apologetically. "Franklin, I'm sorry about all this. She's been getting worse and worse, and Gregory and I haven't done enough to stop her." "Why haven't you?" I asked, genuinely curious. Susan sighed. "Honestly, because it's exhausting to argue with her and she always finds a way to twist things, but this has gone too far. I'll support a recall election if you want to organize one." "Me too," Gregory Kane added, appearing beside Susan. "I never thought she would actually start taking things from people's cars. That's just wrong." Over the next few days, I became the unofficial leader of a small rebellion against Patricia's HOA dictatorship. Tom Martinez and I went door to door, collecting signatures for a special election to recall Patricia from her position as president. We needed signatures from at least 30% of the homeowners to trigger a recall vote, which meant we needed about 40 signatures out of the 130 homes in Westbridge Commons. We got 72. The enthusiasm was overwhelming. Almost everyone we talked to had a complaint about Patricia, and many people were eager to sign the petition just to finally have a chance to remove her from power. The few people who didn't sign either weren't home or said they preferred to stay out of HOA politics entirely, which was fair enough. During this time, Patricia seemed to be lying low. Her Mercedes was parked in her driveway with a very visible crack across the windshield, which I found darkly amusing. She had put a piece of tape over the crack, probably to prevent it from spreading, but it was clear she hadn't gotten it repaired yet. About a week after the emergency meeting, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA, signed by Patricia, informing me that I was being fined $2,000 for harassment and slander against an HOA board member, and organizing a campaign to undermine the HOA's authority. I showed the notice to Clara, who read it with increasing disbelief. "She can't do this," Clara said flatly. "These aren't even real violations. She's just making things up now." "I know," I said, "but what can I do?" "You fight back," Clara said firmly. She pulled out her laptop and started typing. "I'm going to draft a response that we'll send to the entire HOA board, explaining why these fines are retaliatory and illegal, and I'm going to CC our lawyer." "We have a lawyer?" I asked. "We do now," Clara said. "My firm has a real estate division that handles HOA disputes. I'll ask around tomorrow." True to her word, Clara connected me with an attorney named Richard Park, who specialized in homeowner association law. Richard was in his 40s, with graying hair and a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. We met at his office downtown, and I brought all the documentation I had. The original citations from Patricia, the notice about the $2,000 fine, the photos I had taken of Patricia's cracked windshield, and the petition with 72 signatures calling for her recall. Richard reviewed everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Finally, he looked up and said, "This is one of the more clear-cut cases of HOA abuse I've seen. Patricia Whitmore has significantly overstepped her authority, and several of her actions could be considered harassment or even extortion." "So what do we do?" I asked. "First, we respond formally to her fines, explaining why they're invalid and threatening legal action if she continues this pattern of behavior. Second, we proceed with the recall election, which you're well within your rights to organize. Third, if she retaliates further, we consider filing a lawsuit for harassment and seeking damages." "I don't really want to sue anyone," I said. "I just want to live in my house without being constantly harassed." "I understand," Richard said. But sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to make people like Patricia back down. She's used to people rolling over and accepting her authority. Once she realizes there are actual consequences for her behavior, she may change her tune. Richard drafted a strongly worded letter to Patricia and the HOA board, outlining all the ways Patricia had violated both HOA procedures and actual laws. He cited specific statutes about theft, harassment, and the improper assessment of fines. He also made it clear that I was prepared to pursue legal action if the pattern continued. We sent the letter via certified mail, and I personally delivered copies to Susan Drummond and Gregory Kane. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days later, I received an email from Susan, sent to me and the entire HOA board, announcing that Patricia had agreed to rescind the $2,000 fine in the interest of maintaining community harmony. The email was carefully worded to avoid admitting any wrongdoing, but the message was clear. Patricia was backing down, but she wasn't done yet. The recall election was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and in that time, Patricia launched a campaign to save her position. She sent out mass emails to all the homeowners, describing me as a troublemaker who wanted to undermine the HOA's ability to maintain property values. She claimed that without strict enforcement of community standards, Westbridge Commons would descend into chaos, with overgrown lawns and tacky decorations everywhere. Some of her emails were almost comical in their paranoia. One suggested that if I gained control of the HOA, I would allow people to park RVs in their driveways and paint their houses neon colors. Another claimed that I was secretly planning to eliminate all HOA rules entirely, turning our neighborhood into a lawless wasteland. Tom Martinez and I responded with our own email campaign, but we kept our messages simple and factual. We outlined the problems with Patricia's leadership, including the excessive fines, the harassment, and the incident with my ice scraper. We emphasized that we weren't trying to eliminate the HOA, just to restore reasonable, common-sense leadership. The neighborhood became divided. Most people supported the recall, but Patricia did have her supporters, mostly older residents who genuinely believed that strict rule enforcement was necessary to protect their property values. One of these supporters was Douglas Pemberton, a retired corporate executive who lived in one of the larger houses on the golf course side of the development. Douglas cornered me one Saturday morning while I was getting my mail. He was a tall man with silver hair and an imperious bearing that suggested he was used to getting his way. "Franklin," he said, his tone condescending, "I understand you're upset about your little ice scraper incident, but you need to understand the bigger picture. Patricia has been keeping this neighborhood in line, maintaining standards that protect all of our investments. Douglas, she stole from my car and then tried to fine me for the damage she caused herself," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That's not maintaining standards. That's abuse of power." "You're being dramatic," Douglas said dismissively. "Patricia is passionate about this community. She may have made a small error in judgment, but that's no reason to undermine her entirely." "A small error in judgment," I repeated. "She committed theft." "The police confirmed it." Douglas waved his hand. "The police don't understand HOA matters. You need to drop this recall nonsense before you do permanent damage to our community's reputation." "I'm not dropping anything," I said firmly. "If you want to vote to keep Patricia in power, that's your right. But I'm going to vote to remove her, and I'm going to encourage everyone else to do the same." Douglas's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Franklin. Patricia has friends on the board, and if you somehow manage to remove her, we'll make sure your life here is very difficult." "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's a promise," Douglas said, and he turned and walked away. I immediately reported this conversation to Richard Park, who documented it as evidence of continued harassment. But privately, I was starting to feel the stress of the situation. What had started as a simple conflict over an ice scraper had escalated into a full-blown neighborhood war, and I wasn't sure it was worth it. Clara found me that evening sitting on the back porch, staring out at our snow-covered yard. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat down beside me. "Having second thoughts?" she asked gently. "Kind of," I admitted. "I just wanted Patricia to leave me alone. Now it feels like I've started something that's gotten way bigger than I intended." "You didn't start this," Clara pointed out. "Patricia did, when she decided she had the right to take your property. You're just standing up for yourself." "But what if Douglas is right?" I said. "What if removing Patricia just creates more problems?" Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Remember when we first moved here? We loved this neighborhood. The people were friendly, the houses were nice, and yeah, the HOA kept things looking good. But Patricia has turned it into something toxic. People are afraid to put up Christmas decorations because they might be the wrong shade of red. Mrs. Henderson got fined because her newspaper sat on her driveway for 3 hours one morning. That's not a community. That's a dictatorship." She was right. I knew she was right. The recall election took place on a Saturday afternoon at the community center. Richard Park had helped us ensure the process was completely fair and transparent, with ballot boxes and neutral vote counters. The turnout was massive, with over 90% of homeowners showing up to cast their votes. Patricia stood near the front of the room, her arms crossed, watching everyone with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. Douglas Pemberton and a few other supporters stood near her, occasionally shooting hostile looks at me and my group. The voting itself was simple. Yes or no on recalling Patricia Whitmore from her position as HOA president. Richard had explained that if the recall passed, we would need to hold a new election within 30 days to choose a replacement. After everyone had voted, 3 neutral volunteers counted the ballots while the rest of us waited in tense silence. The count took about 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Finally, one of the counters stood up and announced the results. 89 votes in favor of the recall, 32 against, with 5 abstentions. Patricia had been removed from power by a landslide. The room erupted in applause and cheers from the majority of attendees. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, and Clara squeezed my hand. We had done it. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. Douglas Pemberton put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off and grabbed her purse. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're all making a terrible mistake. Without proper leadership, this neighborhood will fall apart. Your property values will plummet. You'll regret this." "We'll take that chance," Tom Martinez called out, and several people laughed. Patricia's eyes found mine across the room, and the hatred in her gaze was palpable. "This is your fault, Franklin Thompson. You've destroyed everything I worked for." "You destroyed it yourself," I replied quietly, "when you decided that rules were more important than people." Patricia stormed out of the community center, and we heard her car peel out of the parking lot moments later. The celebration continued around me, but I felt oddly empty. There was no satisfaction in humiliating Patricia, even though she had brought it on herself. Susan Drummond approached me with a tentative smile. "Franklin, on behalf of the board, I want to apologize for not standing up to Patricia sooner. We should have stopped her long ago." "It's okay," I said. "What's done is done." "The board would like to nominate you as the new president," Susan continued, "if you're interested." I was about to decline automatically, but then I paused. If I didn't step up, would someone else like Patricia take over? Did I have a responsibility to help fix what had been broken? Let me think about it, I said finally. Over the next few days, I discussed the possibility with Clara, Tom, and several other neighbors. The consensus was that I would be a good president, someone who could restore balance and common sense to the HOA without completely abandoning the standards that kept the neighborhood nice. I agreed to run, and in the election 3 weeks later, I won with 74 votes out of 112 cast. My opponent was Douglas Pemberton, who ran on a platform of restoring Patricia's strict enforcement policies. His 38 votes represented a minority, but a significant one. My first action as HOA president was to review and revise the community guidelines. Working with a committee of volunteers, we eliminated or modified the most ridiculous rules, including the one about visible automotive equipment in vehicles. We kept the important standards about property maintenance and exterior modifications, but we added clear language about proportional enforcement and reasonable warnings before fines. We also established a formal appeals process for anyone who felt they had been unfairly cited, and we created term limits for board members to prevent anyone from accumulating too much power. Patricia remained in the neighborhood, but she kept to herself. I would occasionally see her driving past, and she would always look away, refusing to acknowledge me. Her cracked windshield remained unrepaired for weeks, a visible reminder of the incident that had started everything. Then, about 2 months after the recall, something strange happened. I came home from work to find police cars parked in front of Patricia's house. Several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching as officers went in and out of the residence. My stomach dropped, worried that something terrible had happened. Tom Martinez came over to fill me in. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his eyes wide. "Patricia's been arrested." "For what?" I asked, shocked. "Embezzlement," Tom said. "Turns out she's been stealing from the HOA funds for years. Someone tipped off the police, and they got a warrant to search her house and review the financial records." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "How much?" "They're saying over $100,000, Tom replied. She was funneling money into her personal accounts, hiding it with fake invoices for neighborhood maintenance that never happened. Over the following days, the full scope of Patricia's crimes became clear. She had been systematically stealing from the HOA for at least 5 years, using her position as president to approve payments to fake vendors, all of which were actually shell companies she controlled. The money had funded her expensive lifestyle, including her Mercedes, her designer clothes, and frequent vacations. The discovery had come about because Susan Drummond, as the new interim treasurer, had noticed some irregularities in the financial records while preparing the annual budget report. When she dug deeper, she found countless inconsistencies and brought them to the attention of the board. We had immediately contacted the police. Patricia was charged with multiple counts of theft and fraud. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, with clear paper trails showing exactly where the money had gone. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney was pushing for significant prison time given the amount stolen and the duration of the scheme. The trial took place 4 months later, and I attended several days of testimony. Watching Patricia sit at the defendant's table, looking small and defeated, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. She had made my life difficult, had harassed me and many others, but seeing her facing criminal charges was still sobering. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had become addicted to power and money, who had used her position of trust to enrich herself at the expense of her neighbors. They presented evidence of lavish spending, including receipts for designer purses that cost thousands of dollars, jewelry, and a timeshare in Florida that Patricia had purchased with stolen HOA funds. Patricia's defense tried to argue that she had made errors in bookkeeping, but hadn't intended to steal. This argument fell apart when the prosecution showed evidence of the fake vendor companies Patricia had created, complete with forged documents and false invoices. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. He noted that Patricia had violated the trust of her entire community and had shown no remorse for her actions. He sentenced her to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution of $123,000, plus additional fines and penalties. Patricia's house was put up for sale to help cover the restitution payments. Her husband, who had apparently been unaware of her crimes, filed for divorce. It was a complete and devastating fall from grace. As I watched all of this unfold, I couldn't help but think about the ice scraper incident that had started my conflict with Patricia. At the time, it had seemed like such a small thing, a petty theft born of her obsession with HOA rules. But it had been a symptom of a much larger problem. Patricia's fundamental belief that she was above the rules, that her position gave her the right to do whatever she wanted. If she had just apologized for taking my ice scraper, if she had acknowledged that she had made a mistake, maybe none of this would have happened. The recall election might never have occurred, and her financial crimes might have continued undetected for years longer. Instead, her arrogance and refusal to admit fault had set off a chain of events that ultimately led to her exposure and imprisonment. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, Westbridge Commons had settled into a new normal. The HOA was running smoothly under reasonable leadership, with fair enforcement of sensible rules. Property values had actually increased slightly, despite Patricia's predictions of doom, because people were happier and more willing to invest in their homes when they weren't living in fear of arbitrary fines. I had proven to be a decent HOA president, though I made it clear I would only serve 1 term. The job required more time and energy than I had anticipated, and I was looking forward to handing it off to someone else. My ice scraper, the innocent catalyst for all the drama, sat in my truck where it belonged. I used it regularly during the winter months, and it worked perfectly fine, just as it always had. Sometimes I would think about Patricia trying to use it that cold February morning, scraping too hard and cracking her own windshield, and I would shake my head at the absurdity of it all. Clara and I were sitting on our back porch one evening in early summer, enjoying the warm weather and watching fireflies dance across our yard. We had just finished hosting a neighborhood barbecue, a casual gathering that would have been unthinkable under Patricia's reign, and we were tired but happy. "You know," Clara said, sipping her wine, "in a weird way, I'm almost grateful for what happened with Patricia." I looked at her in surprise. "Grateful, not for the stress or the conflict," Clara clarified, "but because it brought the neighborhood together. People who had never talked to each other before became friends. We all realized we had the power to change things if we worked together." She was right. The recall campaign and its aftermath had created bonds between neighbors that might never have formed otherwise. Tom Martinez and I had become close friends. Mrs. Henderson regularly invited us over for dinner. Even Douglas Pemberton had grudgingly accepted the new direction of the HOA and occasionally showed up at community events. "Plus," Clara added with a grin, "you got your ice scraper back." I laughed. "Yeah, there's that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the summer night. Somewhere down the street, kids were playing, their laughter carrying on the breeze. A dog barked. A car drove past slowly, probably neighbors returning from an evening walk. It was peaceful. It was normal. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be. The legal proceedings related to Patricia's crimes continued for another year, as various civil suits were filed and resolved. The HOA ultimately recovered about 80% of the stolen funds through the sale of Patricia's assets and a settlement with her insurance company. The money was used to make long overdue repairs to common areas and to build up a reserve fund. Patricia served her sentence at a minimum security prison about 2 hours away. I never visited her, though I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that her ex-husband did occasionally, mostly to handle paperwork related to their divorce and property settlements. Douglas Pemberton, perhaps humbled by the revelation that his chosen leader had been a criminal, became less hostile and even volunteered to help with some HOA projects. He and I would never be friends, but we achieved a working relationship based on mutual respect for our different perspectives. The new homeowners who bought Patricia's house were a young couple with a baby, Marcus and Jennifer Ellis. They were friendly and enthusiastic about being part of the community, and they had no idea about the dramatic history of their property until several neighbors filled them in at a welcome party. They took it in stride, joking that at least they got a good deal on the house due to its notorious history. As my term as HOA president came to an end, I reflected on everything I had learned. Power, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association, could corrupt people if they weren't careful. Rules were important, but they had to be balanced with common sense and compassion. And communities were strongest when people felt empowered to speak up against injustice, no matter how small it might seem. The ice scraper incident, ridiculous as it was, had taught me that sometimes you have to fight back against bullies, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Patricia had counted on people being too intimidated or too tired to challenge her authority, and for years her strategy had worked. But all it took was one person saying no to start a chain reaction that ultimately brought accountability and positive change. During my final HOA meeting as president, I gave a short speech thanking everyone for their support and cooperation over the past year. I talked about the importance of maintaining our neighborhood while also respecting each other as neighbors and human beings. And I made sure to emphasize that no one, not even the HOA president, was above the rules or the law. The speech was met with applause, and several people came up afterward to shake my hand and thank me for my service. It felt good to end on a positive note, knowing that I was leaving the HOA in better shape than I had found it. Susan Drummond was elected as the new president, running unopposed. She was organized, fair-minded, and had learned from both Patricia's negative example and my more moderate approach. I had no doubt she would do an excellent job. As Clara and I drove home from that final meeting, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter of my life dominated by HOA drama was finally over. I could go back to being just another homeowner, living my life without the weight of community politics on my shoulders. "How does it feel?" Clara asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Good," I said honestly. "Really good." We pulled into our driveway, and I noticed my ice scraper sitting on the dashboard where I had left it after clearing some morning dew off the windshield earlier in the week. I should probably put it away in the garage now that summer was here, I thought. But then I decided to leave it exactly where it was. Let it be a reminder, I thought. A reminder that small acts of standing up for yourself can lead to bigger changes. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary objects can become symbols of resistance against petty tyranny. A reminder that justice, even delayed, is worth fighting for. Inside the house, we kicked off our shoes and collapsed on the couch, exhausted but satisfied. Our home felt peaceful, a sanctuary that we had fought to protect from harassment and overreach. The struggle had been worth it. Over the following months and years, life in Westbridge Commons continued with a much healthier dynamic. The HOA enforced reasonable rules reasonably. People took care of their properties without living in fear, and the neighborhood thrived. Patricia became a cautionary tale, occasionally mentioned when discussing HOA policies, but mostly fading into the background of community memory. I ran into Patricia's ex-husband, David, about 2 years after her sentencing. He was at the grocery store, looking tired but relieved. We made awkward small talk, and eventually he said, "I'm sorry for what she put you through. I had no idea what she was doing with the stealing or the harassment." "It's not your fault," I assured him. "You couldn't have known." "Still," David said, "I should have paid more attention." There were signs. The expensive purchases, her obsession with control. I just didn't want to see it. We parted on good terms, and I felt a measure of sympathy for him. He had been a victim of Patricia's deception too, in his own way. The ice scraper remained in my truck, a faithful tool that had never failed me. Every winter, when I used it to clear frost and ice from my windshield, I would think about that cold February morning when Patricia had taken it. And I would think about how such a small act of theft had ultimately unraveled an entire web of corruption and abuse. Sometimes Clara would joke that we should frame the ice scraper, turn it into a piece of neighborhood folklore. I always laughed and said the ice scraper was happiest doing its job, clearing windshields without drama or fanfare. Years later, when new neighbors would move into Westbridge Commons and ask about the HOA, longtime residents would tell them about Patricia Whitmore and the ice scraper incident. The story became legend, growing slightly more elaborate with each retelling, but always maintaining its core truth: that standing up to abuse of power, no matter how small or petty, was important. And that ice scraper, the humblest of automotive tools, had accidentally become the catalyst for positive change in an entire community. Not because there was anything special about the scraper itself, but because one person decided that enough was enough, that being right mattered more than being comfortable, and that justice was worth pursuing even when the stakes seemed small. The neighborhood flourished under reasonable leadership. Property values did increase. People were happier. And most importantly, residents felt safe in their own homes, free from the paranoia and harassment that had characterized Patricia's reign. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about Patricia in prison, serving her sentence for crimes that had gone undetected for so long. I wondered if she ever thought about the ice scraper, about how that single act of petty theft had been the first domino in a chain that led to her downfall. I wondered if she had any regrets, any understanding of how her actions had hurt people. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. She had taken up enough of my time and energy. She had caused enough stress and conflict. The best revenge, I decided, was simply living well and being part of a healthy, functional community. My term as HOA president became a story I would occasionally tell at parties or gatherings, usually at the urging of Clara or Tom. People were always amazed by the whole saga, by how a dispute over an ice scraper had exposed massive financial fraud and led to criminal prosecution. "That's insane," people would say. "You can't make this stuff up." And they were right. The whole thing was so absurd, so perfectly ridiculous that it seemed like fiction. But it had all really happened, every strange and frustrating moment of it. The ice scraper sat in my truck, year after year, doing its job without complaint. It never broke, never failed, never caused any problems. It was just a good, reliable tool that worked exactly as designed. Unlike Patricia Whitmore, who had been designed to serve her community but had instead served only herself, the ice scraper remained true to its purpose. And in that constancy, in that simple reliability, there was a kind of poetry. Life went on in Westbridge Commons. Seasons changed. People moved in and out. Children grew up. The neighborhood evolved and adapted as all neighborhoods do. But the lessons learned during that tumultuous year remained. That communities are strongest when they resist tyranny, even petty tyranny. That transparency and accountability matter, and that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. And somewhere in a prison in Ohio, Patricia Whitmore served her time, a fallen tyrant brought down not by grand conspiracy or dramatic confrontation, but by her own arrogance and an ice scraper she never should have stolen. The story of Patricia Whitmore and the ice scraper became a permanent part of Westbridge Commons history, told to new residents and occasionally referenced when discussing HOA policies. It served as a reminder of what could go wrong when power went unchecked, and what could go right when people stood together for common sense and fairness. In the end, justice had been served, both for the petty theft of an ice scraper and for the far more serious crime of embezzling from the community. The neighborhood had survived its trial by fire and emerged stronger, more united, and more vigilant against future abuses of power. And that ice scraper, that humble tool that had started it all, continued to do what it was made to do. Clear ice from windshields on cold winter mornings, one scrape at a time, without drama or pretension or any desire for recognition, just like a good tool should.